Welcome back. Today we're going to examine the 14th century, which, as you'll see, was a time of real transition from the Middle Ages or medieval period to the beginning of the Renaissance. It's important to note that this transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance was a gradual transition that took place over many decades, and it just did not occur one year to the next. Now, during the 13th century, there were three major events that totally devastated the social order in Western Europe. The first is referred to as the Great Schism. Schism means a break in ideas or ideologies. We had seen during the Holy Roman Empire that the Pope ruled dominant over culture and life throughout Western Europe. However, there were three contenders for the papacy over a period of about 70 years, and they were, in essence, held captive at Avignon in southern France because of the great disagreements among various Catholics. There also became an increasing number of demands for the church to reform itself at this time. Historians pretty much agree there was massive corruption in the church, and this largely had to do with monks, priests, and bishops often selling pilgrims false relics. So this might be a pig's bone or a chicken bone, and they would claim that it was the part of the bone of a saint. Also, the church was very, very tied in with the nobility, had very close ties, both economic and political. And the net result was the vast majority of the people, the peasants, became alienated. And it was at this time that Chaucer's famous Canterbury Tales was written in England. And this, you may well have read in high school, was a satire of the decadence of the church. So the second major development during this century that impacted on society was the Hundred Years' War. Now, this was between France and England. The war didn't last constantly for 100 years, but it was a stalemate. They might fight for a year or two, then there'd be no fighting for 3 or 4 years, then they'd fight for 6 or 7 years, and then nothing for 10 years. But it's referred to as the Hundred Years' War because there was periodic warfare for 100 years between these major rivals. The net result was, and what for our course we're most interested in, it led to widespread misery in France because virtually all the fighting took place in France. Now, the French kings hired mercenaries to fight on their behalf, but when they weren't fighting the English, the mercenaries went out into the villages and really were just like pirates in the villages. They went in, they attacked the people, they stole their property. And so it's really safe to say there was great misery in France during much of this decade. And the third factor, of which you've undoubtedly heard, was the so-called Black Death or bubonic plague, which arrived in Western Europe around the middle of the century, 1348 to be exact, but you could think of it around 1350. It entered Europe from China along the so-called Silk Road. This was a major trade route from Asia that went to the Black Sea. Ships would go across the Black Sea, down near Constantinople, and into the Mediterranean Ocean. And this is a bacterial infection, and the bacteria that causes this disease is transmitted by fleas that would live on the rats in the merchant boats, or sometimes the rats would be in the back of a cart in a cargo of grain. And the rats themselves, even though they were bitten by the fleas, had some sort of immunity to the bubonic plague or the Black Death, so they didn't get sick. The rats were merely the carriers. The net result was the bubonic plague moved quickly. It killed roughly 50% of the population, half of the population in all of Western Europe in just a few years. And in some cities, such as Paris, it is estimated up to 90%, that's 9 out of 10 people, died within a few weeks when the Black Death or bubonic plague moved through. It spread very, very rapidly. It also killed rapidly and caused great pain. The word bubonic plague, bubonic comes from a Latin word that means a bulbous, like something that looks like an onion, because one of the symptoms was under people's armpits and their necks, they had large, large lumps that were purple in color, and they were about the size of a golf ball. But so it became known as the bubonic plague, and there was great, great pain. People were infected. There was obviously no modern medicine then. I'll talk in a few minutes about how the plague, which continues to this very day, how it is treated with antibiotics today. But people had great pain. Given the lack of medical knowledge, family would come by, hug people, cuddle them, and it spread two ways. The bacteria is spread by a flea biting someone, but it's also spread as a respiratory illness. So the person who is very ill, he or she is on the bed coughing and coughing. Other people would come up without any sort of face coverings, and they would contract the bubonic plague. And the people usually died within 3 days. It was not really known at that time what spread it, although there were people obviously realized it was contagious because you would hear reports how it was on the other side of the river, killing many people, and within a day or two, sure enough, the plague would come and infect people. In many cities, when someone in a family, in a house, contracted the bubonic plague, no one was allowed to leave that house. A police guard was put outside, and everybody died in the house. Now, this is a map showing you the extensive trade routes in Western Europe and North Africa. And you can see to the right on the slide the Silk Road that goes off to China, again called Silk Road because the main import was silk in addition to spices. And then you can see it was through these major trade routes that the bubonic plague passed through Europe. Now, this slide shows the rapid extent to which the bubonic plague spread. You can see the line, the most southerly line, December 31st, 1347. It was there touching southern France and not quite in Italy. Just 6 months later, the next line as we move north, June 30th, it's all the way up to Paris. It's all of Italy is infected. And, within a year and a half or 2 years, the plague moved throughout most of Western Europe. This is a slide also showing the spread of the bubonic plague. This might be a little easier for you to read with the different colors. You can see 1347 is in orange, 1348 is in the reddish color, then the pink color, and then the blue color. You obviously don't have to memorize all these dates, but I just want you to see how widespread it was and how quickly it spread. Now, of course, at that time, They did not understand the germ theory of disease. They had no microscopes. Even if they wanted to look for the bacteria, there was no way they could visually see it. So many of the leading scientists claimed that it was due probably to a strange alignment of the planets that had taken place 3 years earlier in 1345, when three of the planets had been in alignment when viewed from the Earth, and this was considered a sign that there was going to be disease. Many people felt that the disease was God punishing humans for their sins. And the many people who felt that turned to Jews and prostitutes as the primary reason God had sent the bubonic plague, to punish people. Many thousands of Jews were rounded up, tied to stakes, and burned to death throughout Western Europe. Likewise, prostitutes, they weren't killed. They were generally moved from the city out into buildings on the outskirts of the city. In addition, since the early Greeks, particularly since Aristotle, Europeans had believed that disease was caused by night vapors, what were called miasmas. There was some sort of fog or night vapor that came out. And so those who believed in that, who had the money, left the cities. So you had relatively few wealthy people dying because they could hear reports that the plague was 10 or 15 miles away in another village. They knew that it was moving. They didn't know quite how. They thought the night vapors. So what they did is the very wealthy went out and had country houses. Others just went out and lived on farms or whatnot. So the vast majority of the deaths were very poor people. Now, what was the reaction of some people in terms of religion? Well, when you realized that the plague was killing at least half the people in the neighboring village and it was headed your way, some people became much more religious. They went to the priests. They said confession, because in Christianity then, and continued with the Roman Catholic Church, a person could say confession, and the priest, acting in the name of God, would forgive them of all their sins, and they would go to heaven. So you had many people becoming more religious. Others did just the opposite. They turned against the church. They said everybody, all the clergy, up through and including the Pope, are praying, and it's useless. And for these people, this greatly weakened the authority that the church had. In terms of medical history, this is the first time that we know of that doctors began to look at their patients in terms of clinical practice. They made detailed notes on a person's temperature, their physical state, and then through process of trial and error, tried many types of plants and chemicals to see what effect it would have on the treatment of the disease. And the Pope's personal physician did this, and his detailed notebooks were used for several centuries by those trying to study disease accompanied by fever, not just bubonic plague, and trying to determine the best way to treat the disease. Now, the many deaths among the poor, and of course the vast majority of the people were poor peasants. Once the bubonic plague had passed and the economies started to recover, economic growth greatly increased because there were fewer poor people, they were paid more money, and this led to greater consumption. And I might add that most scientists who've studied the Black Death in detail have concluded that as it moved through, the disease killed many of the hosts, the bacteria, And then, because of quarantine measures, the disease quickly died out. Now, this is a very familiar drawing for anyone who's familiar with the Black Death. This is the so-called Black Death doctor who wears a mask in the shape of a beak, and that beak is full of wool or substances like cotton, not necessarily cotton, but wool, soaked with various spices and, and herbs. The idea being, approaching a dead body, the doctor wouldn't have to smell it, but also it was felt that the spices and the aromas in the nose would block any sort of foul air. If you've seen Disney's famous movie, The Beauty and the Beast, you may recall that near the end of the movie, Belle asked her father about her mother, and there's a description of how her mother died in Paris, and it was from the bubonic plague, the Black Death, and the mother, seeing what's happening to her, said to the father, "Quick, take Belle and leave." And on the chair next to the mother, we see the mask with the beak of the Black Death doctor who had just visited her. Just of general interest, of course, this won't be on the examination, sort of what happened after the 14th century to the bubonic plague. Well, the first known outbreak to scientists was in the 6th century when 25 million people died. I mean, 25 million is a tremendous number of people today. In the 6th century, it was a high percentage of the overall population. There have been many, many smaller outbreaks recorded since then. In terms of the United States, in the 1850s, there was a major outbreak of bubonic plague in China, and then that moved to India, where 13 million Indians died, and then it moved on ships to Hawaii, and eventually San Francisco, California, where 113 people died of bubonic plague. In 2015, there were 750 confirmed cases of bubonic plague globally. 16 of those were in the United States, and it's believed that very few of those cases were due to rats, but rather fleas having infected squirrels or rodents that people had touched. Generally, people recover if they're treated immediately with antibiotics. If not, there's a 30 to 90% death rate if you contract bubonic plague. I myself was traveling to a very remote area in Southeast Asia, and when I worked for the State Department, I was required to get a vaccination before traveling to Asia. And in fact, on my international shot record, which some of you may have seen, it's a yellow card you have to carry when you go into certain countries. I looked at it the other day and I could see, and it said bubonic plague. And finally, on the subject of bubonic plague, before we move to art, this is the first known example of what today we call biological warfare. During the 14th century, when Mongols were attacking other cities, and particularly during siege warfare, where they would surround another city, they would take the bodies of Mongols who had just died or were still alive but dying of bubonic plague. They'd put them on a catapult and hurl them over the city walls, and people inside the city tried to move these dead bodies coming over. They contracted the bubonic plague. Now, during World War II, there was a horrific example of biological warfare. The Japanese experimented on humans, including prisoner of war, by injecting them with bubonic plague to see the impact on the humans. This was not done in an attempt to find a cure, but rather to see how to effectively kill the enemy. Well, after doing these experiments, the Japanese military infected millions and millions of fleas with bubonic plague. I'm not sure how they did that, but they did that. And then they put those fleas in boxes, and they dropped the boxes with parachutes from airplanes over large Chinese cities. And the boxes were designed so when they hit the ground at a low speed, because they had a parachute, they would open and the fleas would fly out. And this was unfortunately very successful, and there were massive outbreaks of bubonic plague after these attacks. After the Second World War ended, there was an International War Crimes Tribunal or trial. There was one in Europe, in Nuremberg, and there was one in Asia for the Japanese. And a Japanese general by the name of Kawashima proudly announced during the trial that he was proud of how many Chinese he had killed through the program that he was in charge of infecting fleas with bubonic plague and dropping them by parachute. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison because this was considered a crime against humanity. Now we'll switch gear and start looking at the world of art and architecture during the 14th century. What we're starting to see now during the 14th century, the century of transition, is the rebirth of classical art when people start to observe the natural world. This doesn't happen overnight, it happens over several decades. And of course, when we get to the Renaissance in the next century, the Renaissance is French for rebirth, and it's the rebirth of classical Rome and Greece. So Italian art starts to emphasize classical models. We see much greater focus on naturalism. We get away from the flat, two-dimensional figures of medieval art, and we start seeing more emphasis placed on the emotions of people. We will see much coming in from Byzantium, from the Constantinople area, since many people, including artists, had fled the massive fighting near Constantinople. And this would include the Byzantine use, which we saw earlier, of gold leaf. Now we're finding the art world, and we'll see that the Renaissance is centered in Italy, creating techniques that they wanted to try and really suggest three-dimensionality and recreate volume on a two-dimensional surface. There have been attempts at this before, but now, as we'll come to see in the Renaissance, they bring this to perfection. Now, this is the pulpit of a church in Pisa in northern Italy. The pulpit, of course, is where the priest goes to read from the Bible during a religious service. And here we can see several distinct types of art. We can see the medieval trefoil arches, the sort of three arches, which you often see in medieval windows. We can see the Roman curved arch, and we can see the columns, the capitals are Corinthian, which of course is Greek and Roman. As we will see next lecture, the Renaissance was born or began in Florence. And it's no coincidence that we see that the first painter to attempt realism is Cimabue. We'll look at just one or two of his works here. He did a famous work, which is 12 feet high, of the Madonna enthroned with angels. So we have the Madonna, the Mother of Christ, sitting on a throne with angels around her. So here Here is the Madonna enthroned with angels. You can see gold leaf background, very Byzantine. That's actually gold pounded into very small pieces, glued on to this as a wood background. This is not painted on canvas, it's done on wood. And that gold leaf is symbolized heaven, heavenly light, and of course each piece is placed slightly at an angle to reflect. We see Mary or Madonna holding Christ. Around the throne, as I mentioned, are angels, and down below, these are the prophets, the Jewish prophets from the Old Testament. We know that because they have scrolls there, and they wrote about the coming of the Messiah or the Christ. As you look at this, you could look at it. There's not much three-dimensionality here. It's starting to come out. You can see a little shadowing under Mary's chin, on her neck. You can see very much the Byzantine gold halos on all the angels, on Mary, and on Christ. It's not very realistic. Look at how Mary holding her baby with one hand and a big drop in front of her. No mother would do that. It's not very realistic. But if you look at her drapery, you can see much more realistic folds than we saw in the medieval period. You also don't see too much linear perspective. Look at the size of the angels' heads. The angels in the back, their heads are only slightly smaller from those in the front. And now we're going to contrast Cimabue with Giotto, who was by far the most famous painter in Florence in the 14th century. And we'll see how Giotto produced a similar work, but with much more realism and moving towards the Renaissance. So as I mentioned, Giotto was the most eminent painter in Florence in the 14th century. He was very famous for his realism, both in the physical details that he painted, but also emotions. Getting back to the Greeks and Romans who wanted a painting not just to be a reproduction of nature, but also express emotions. And he wanted his paintings to resemble sculpture, but sculpture on a two-dimensional surface. He very, very skillfully used light and shadows. Now this is the same theme as we saw with the other artist, Cimabue, Madonna enthroned, surrounded by angels. Now if we look at this here, we don't see the prophets underneath. They've moved the prophets up. You can see a couple of them. If you look at Christ, right to the right of his head, as we look at it, you can see one of the prophets peering through the opening on the throne. This has much more three-dimensionality. You look at the throne, you can look and see how Mary and Christ are sitting back on it. If you look at the angels, you can see how the angels in the back, their heads are slightly smaller. Now let's move to a close-up of Mary and baby Christ. Okay. Here we have a close-up, as I mentioned. Now, another famous early work of Giotto is Lamentation. Lament, of course, means to grieve, express concern, and this is considered a real classic masterpiece of emotions. We'll see it on the next slide. Okay, here we see, and I have a close-up of the next slide, but this is Christ when he's dead, he's taken off the cross. You see in the upper part of the painting, the angels, quite exaggerated way, expressing their grief, almost pulling their hair out. You see in the foreground, Mary holding her son. You can see the grief on her face. You can see um, the other women expressing great grief. You also are brought into this painting because we have two figures in the foreground and we just see their backs. And we also have some linear perspective here by, you can see that wall that goes off diagonally. And if you look at it carefully, the width of that wall is greater in the front of the painting than in the upper right. And even though this is painted on a two-dimensional surface, it certainly looks as if that wall is receding into the background. Now this is a close-up of Christ and the people in the immediate circle. You can see the two men on the right, the two apostles on the right. You can see in their face great concern. Again, you can see Mary's grieving, and you could really see the angels above, literally almost pulling their hair out in grief. Now let's turn from painting to architecture. What we start seeing in the 14th century is we still have churches being built. We'll see a lot more of that, but what we also have is civic pride. People very proud of their city. Now, Italy, you recall, did not become a country, a unified country, until the 1860s, about 150 years ago. So, as I've mentioned earlier in the course, you had many city-states. You had Florence, Siena, Venice, and whatnot. And they were competing. They were competing economically, and they sometimes went to war with each other. But they also had a lot of civic pride. And so there was a lot of building of city centers. The focus was not on building right here the most beautiful cathedral, as we saw the Gothic cathedrals, but rather building city halls and attractive and massive centers. The two wealthiest cities in central Italy at this time were Siena and Florence, and we'll talk a lot more about these as the course goes along. And they had a lot of banking and commerce, and fortunately for the art world, many of the wealthy people became patrons of artists and paid the artists to paint or create statues, other works of art, either for the wealthy people themselves for their homes or their private churches, or to be donated to the city or to the church. And what we'll see here is in the city of Siena, a modern photograph of the city center. It's called the Palazzo Pubblico. And here it is. You can see the large watchtower in the center. That watchtower was to be on the lookout in case a neighboring city-state would decide to attack. They had small armies, and periodically they had attacked. But you can see the city administrative building underneath the lookout tower. And to this very day, the people of Siena are very, very proud of their city center. This is an aerial view of the same city center in Siena. And once a year, they have a horse race around the perimeter there. It looks like a road. But you can see looking down, particularly in this aerial view, how close the houses are. Well, of course, at that time, the only means of transportation was really walking for the vast, vast majority of the people. So the cities were very, very congested. And this is just another view of Siena, the magnificent tower and this, what we'd call today the City Hall or municipal building. Now moving to the north of Italy, we've already talked about Venice, which at this time was among, if not the most wealthy city in the world because it controlled the trade through the Mediterranean. Now the Doge was like the prince. This is what we see here, the prince's palace. and this building is still used by the city of Venice. And so this was the administrative center of the city. The Doge had his offices there, and on the right side of the building were the courts, which would hear criminal cases and then perhaps or more condemn someone for life in prison. This is, on the left we have the Doge's palace, and then this is the bridge that goes over on the right to the prison. You can still see the bars on the prison. This is referred to as the Bridge of Sighs because it's said that as the prisoners were given their sentence and marched off to the prison, they were allowed to have one last look out of those little windows and told that's the last you'll see of daylight or Venice, and they would sigh and go off to their fate. And as you can see, Venice has no roads, no cars. Everything is connected through waterways. This looks like a classic postcard picture, the iconic shot of Venice. This is the Grand Canal. Most of the canals are much, much smaller, as you'll see in a minute. And these are the famous gondolas, which are quite expensive, several $100s an hour. And the gondolier, as they call them, will push that with a pole because the canals aren't very deep. And this is a very honored profession, which goes back almost 1,000 years, and it usually runs in the family, but people have to pass an exam. It's just, it's just like anyone can do this, and they're really quite skillful. They're quite skillful in doing this. Here's a more typical view of a residential area in Venice. You can see the canal here is much smaller. A bridge that's not particularly ornate, and this is the only way for people to move around. This is perhaps a more picturesque photograph, but again, it's people hanging their laundry out to dry, small bridges. Again, there are no roads, so if you need to call an ambulance, the ambulance is a boat, and the ambulance will go down the appropriate canals to get to wherever you are and take you to a hospital. This is a shot of the trash boat, and you can see the man about to get in the boat has a dumpster, and he's putting it on the trash boat. When I lived in Rome, my family and I went to Venice for a week during the famous Carnival in February. We rented an apartment just right near there, and we'd see this every day. I mean, so you had to walk everywhere. This is to buy fresh fruit and vegetables. Behind it, you can see a small store, but virtually every day this boat would come in with fruit and vegetables and eggs and whatnot. So the city life is very, very much centered on the canals. And believe it or not, they actually have water taxis. Here I'm in a water taxi taking this photograph, and you go to water taxi points, or you can even call them and tell them where you are, and they take you around. So it's a unique city in the world. And last, this is just a photo of my wife and daughter, who's down at the bottom asleep. She's like a year old, and it's in February. It's like 20 degrees outside, and a few hours later we got 6 inches of snow. But even though it was so cold, it was, as you can see, absolutely mobbed by tourists. And on the right, you have Doge's Palace. On the back, you have what we saw before when we looked at the Byzantium Empire, St. Mark's Cathedral. Okay, thank you very much.